If that's a question that we need to like address, and I'm going to turn on the if that's a question that we need to like address, and I'm going to turn on the recording, and maybe we'll pick it up. So sure.
There's so many things.
If that's a question that we need to like address, and I'm going to turn on the recording, and maybe we'll pick it up. If that's a question that we need to like address, and I'm going to turn on the if that's a question that we need to like address, and I'm going to turn on the recording, and maybe we'll pick it up. So sure.
There's so many things that make a good producer. You have to be knowledgeable, and I'll tell you. Let me start out by saying what
if that's a question that we need to like address, and I'm going to turn on the recording, and maybe we'll pick it up. So if that's a question that we need to like address, and I'm going to turn on the recording, and maybe we'll pick it up. If that's a question that we
The art of making art is putting it together bit by bit.
Welcome back. Here we are in season 2, understanding and exploring the role of writers in the Broadway ecosystem. Before I get started, I did have a request from Allison Cloud. Allison, you were asking about my move to New York. And for those who don't know, I currently live in Salt Lake City, and I'm making, along with my family, the move to the New York metro area. And we're thrilled. And I wanted to share that it has been in the works in a long time. We've actually taken 3 house hunting trips to that area. And when I first started producing in this field, I knew that I needed to be a part of the epicenter, if you will, of where Broadway happens. And my daughter is graduating from high school, and also my son is graduating from junior high, and my youngest is graduating from elementary school. So with all of this transition, it felt natural to make that transition now. So we're super excited. Our house is listed. It's actually under contract. We have an inspector coming to today. So it's very exciting, very involved, and we are thrilled to be closer to Broadway. And also what I think I can bring to the mix is a perspective of what it's like to want to create in the Broadway epicenter without living there, because I have that lived experience too. But this will maybe save some travel. I hope I can maintain my Sky Miles status. But more importantly, as a family, our mantra is we are better together. And the long distance trips has been taxing for all of us, including my good husband, David, who as he works from home, has been able to carry the load, if you will, of our family for the last couple of years. And we just realized that there was a season in our life when he was commuting for various business things, and I know what that's like. And we just settled that we're better together. So we're excited for the adventure. Most of you know I did my undergraduate work at Emerson in Boston. So I'm excited for the East Coast. Ironically, my daughter will be in the Washington, D.C. area, serving a ecclesiastical service mission. So we will all be on the East Coast time zone, except for my son and his wife, who are still finishing college. He's still finishing college. She's done and is working, but they are staying in Utah for a season. But grad school may be a great time to bring the entire Rasmussen clan east. So for those of you who are on the East Coast, I can't wait to be closer to you. For those of you who are not, I hope that I can be a liaison, as it were, and if nothing else, through this podcast, share the different perspective of seeing perhaps more shows and directors and designers and music directors and actors, all of the elements that come together to make Broadway fantastic bit by bit. Here we go. Michael, you are the first return guest on Broadway's Bit by Bit podcast. We've had multiple requests to bring you back, and I understand why. You're knowledgeable, and it's clear you're passionate about the work, and you're also passionate about helping others. So welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I really enjoy this.
Great. Well, you do a great job. We this season, as you know, is a deep dive into the writer's perspective, the writer's contribution to building Broadway bit by bit. So let's just jump right in. Let's talk about granting and acquiring rights. The granting and acquiring of rights is the foundational contract. Yes?
Right. Yeah, that's true. Now, before we really jump in, I should get, like I did the last time, the sort of the disclaimer out of the way, right? That I'm not providing any kind of specific legal advice. This is all just sort of general informational information that I'm providing, and every deal is going to be a little bit different. And if anyone has any specific questions or concerns, or they should contact a lawyer for advice. So now that we have that out of the way, but yes, in the theater world, the agreement with the authors is like you said, the foundational contract. That's true in other, in film and TV, but the big difference in the theater world, generally speaking, there are exceptions, but in the world of theater, the author of the play, or if it's a musical, the writers of the book, music, lyrics, the authors retain copyright ownership in their work, which is usually not the case for film and TV projects. So given what I just said, the authors retain copyright ownership in their work. They will be the ones who will be granting some other party, a producer presumably, or a theater, or will be the one acquiring the rights. And this is really the first step in any theater project. Is if you're a producer and there's a play out there that you want to produce, the very first thing you need to do is make sure that you have that you've acquired the rights from the authors to go forward and do it. And the quote authors might not just be the people who wrote the book, music, lyrics, but that term could also include, depending on the project, if it's a musical that's based on some other work, based on a movie or based on a book, if there's some underlying property. It's common nowadays in a lot of musicals on Broadway, jukebox musicals that use pre-existing music, songs that are not originally written solely for that particular musical. You'd have to go out and get the rights to those pre-existing songs. That usually means dealing with various music publishing companies. The big ones are Universal and Warner Chappell. Yes, that's definitely the starting point, is acquiring the rights, and then what that means we can get into the various points that are involved with that.
Well, Michael, I know a lot of writers who are actually interested in creating a musical based on the music or the body of music of a famous person. Can you, in your experience, can you talk through what would be the first 2 steps for a writer interested in incorporating somebody else's music into a musical? How would they go about doing that? I'm sure you do that all the time.
I have a lot of projects that involve going out and getting rights in pre-existing songs. And like I said, you'd have to go and deal with the music publishing companies. And what we're talking about is getting the right to use those songs in a live stage production. You're not going to get a broad grant of rights. It's usually very limited. If you're doing the acquiring, you want to get as broad a grant of rights as possible, and the one granting the rights typically wants to limit it and to certain productions or certain territories of the world, certain languages. And that's where there's this negotiation back and forth, how extensive will the grant of rights be? And the grant can go beyond just live stage. It can include, audio visual productions, merchandise, cast albums, podcasts, cruise ship productions. It's similar to acquiring the rights from the authors of a musical, in that there will typically be some upfront option payment. There will be a royalty, a credit provision, a billing credit, not the same sort of credit that the authors were getting. It would not be a title page in the playbill. When you're dealing with pre-existing music, it's usually somewhere on the further back in smaller type. In the back of the playbill, there might be a page that just lists, that gives the credits for the pre-existing music. The song, let's say if it's an entire catalog of songs, like, for example, MJ, this Michael Jackson musical. And there's plenty of other examples, recent examples on Broadway, the Cher musical. But if you're talking about an entire catalog of songs from one artist, that's an easier thing to deal with in terms of the obtaining the rights. Then you're probably just dealing with one music publisher, maybe two. On the other hand, if you have a musical like the stage production of Moulin Rouge, I mean, I know the people who dealt with getting the rights for all of those various pre-existing songs, and I forget now how many songs there were. I mean, maybe it was over 100. I might be wrong about that, but it was, and many of them don't use the entire song. There might just be a little snippet, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Some of them might use 30 seconds, a minute. But that involved going out to many, many different parties, different music publishers, and you want to, you can't just be dealing in a vacuum. This all has to be sort of a coordinated effort. So you want all of them to kind of agree to the same terms on a pro rata basis, most favored nations basis. Well, let's say you have a musical that's a mix of you might have some original songs, and then maybe there's 4 or 5 pre-existing. Generally, the way that would work is the overall royalty for the music and lyrics. Let's say it's, the standard on Broadway would be a 4.5% of the gross box office receipts, subject to a royalty pool calculation, but put that aside for a second. But let's say it's 4.5% of the gross. That's for all of the music and lyrics. If, let's say there's 20 songs, but 5 of them, a quarter of them are pre-existing songs, then those pre-existing songs would get a quarter of the 4.5%. And the composer lyricists of the new original songs would get 75%. So it get the total overall royalty wouldn't increase. It would just get split up among the various songwriters.
Michael, as you talk through these specifics, it's just a reminder that each deal is different, that each particular arrangement and the amount of songs or the amount of pre-existing material, the underlining material can vary with each project. And one should consult an attorney like yourself, and specifically an entertainment attorney, to understand the nuances of each deal. But what we're hearing is that rights can also be broken down into I also heard you said you could be broken down into different bundles. You can not all the rights are granted the same. You have a first class right or second class rights or various territories or U.S. or English language speaking countries or international cruise ships. So if one has a project they're interested in either in producing or as an investor trying to pull together some elements, they should at least be aware that the writers need to have permission to use the underlining rights. That would be our very first step. And then for that producer to be able to acquire those rights from the authors. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, that's true. Now, if there's an underlying property involved, sometimes the authors of the musical, could be a play or musical. I'll just stick with musicals for purposes of this discussion. Sometimes the authors will take it upon themselves and go out and acquire the rights from the underlying property. Usually not, because that can be pretty expensive. It can take up a lot of time, legal fees, and it can be a pretty lengthy negotiation. But not always, and it depends on the property. If it's a well-known sort of big Hollywood movie, and you're dealing with one of the major Hollywood movie studios, then that's going to be a lengthier negotiation and probably cost a lot more. it could easily be 20, 30, or even up to $50,000 per year for each 12-month option period. And as getting it's a long process. The development of a stage musical takes time. From the time you first go out and acquire the rights, especially if you're starting with underlying rights and with a studio, then you've got to get the rights from the authors, and the play has to be written, and there's a developmental process. There could be readings and workshops and a production at a not-for-profit theater, and it takes several years, probably 4 or 5 years at a minimum, and sometimes takes 7, 8, 9 years, or some projects have been in development for 10 years or more. Of course, in recent years we had the industry shut down because of the pandemic, but even putting that aside, it can really take a significant amount of time, many years, to develop a project. So if you've got to be paying option payments for all of those years, it can really add up. And option payments not only to the studio, but then there would be separate payments to the authors. I should maybe just point out, so when there is not all projects have an underlying property. You could have a completely original play that's not based on any other property, and then you wouldn't have to deal with getting underlying rights. Where there is an underlying rights owner involved, the typical formula, often the underlying rights owner is thought of as the quote fourth department, with the original 3 departments being book, music, lyrics, if it's a musical. And then you have the underlying rights, which is, considered the 4th department. So if you take the aggregate royalty that's paid to the book writer, composer, lyricist, and underlying rights, that gets split up, usually, not always the case, but usually it's shared 25% each. So you take the total amount, the aggregate royalty that's paid to the authors, book, music, lyrics, underlying rights, and that gets split up, 25% each. That's the basic sort of formula in terms of the split between authors and underlying rights owner.
That's helpful. I know authors are interested in what that split can be. There also can be really well versed. Many are part of the Dramatists League and understand those nuances. If you were Michael, if you had a client who said, I want to go after the rights for this song and I need to approach one of these publishing houses, like what can they do to help make their application for those granting of rights appealing? Or is it all about the option? Is it about the teams that's put together? Is it about the writer? If you're an emerging writer, like what's your tips for making a case to be the one that would be able to receive these granting rights for a project?
Yeah, very good question. I think the couple things to keep in mind. In my experience, the music publishers, the last thing on their mind is dealing with the theater world. Although now it's becoming more and more common, and many of the major music publishers now have dedicated people on staff who deal with theater and are becoming more familiar with the standard sort of customary terms in the theater industry. So that's helpful. But still, when you think about all of the various, the music publishing companies are dealing with the use of these songs for all sorts of other purposes outside of theater, in motion pictures, in TV, in television ads. Think about it. The next time you're just sitting back watching TV and ads, all sorts of ads, commercials pop up, pay attention to the music that's in the background on these TV ads. And often they are known songs that you'll recognize. And it's not like they just decided, let's use this song in our ad. They had to go out and get the rights to do that and probably pay a pretty hefty amount of money to use those ads in TV commercials. So to use songs in a Broadway show, it's not something that these music publishers are really, it's not like at the top of their mind. But to your question, what would make an application more appealing? I think you want to spell it out. You want to send a written proposal that's really well organized and spelled out and with clear points, bullet points or numbered points, with a clear summary, just with a description. This is where we want to acquire the right to use this song in this particular musical. Maybe give a little summary. Here's what the show is about. A lot of times they'll ask, how will this song be used? Give us a description of the specific scene in the show. What's happening in this scene and how will the song be used? Often they are going to want to know that the lyrics will not be changed, or they want approval over any change in the lyrics. The music publishers tend to be, they want approval over any use of the song outside of live stage. For example, any promotional use in advertisements, TV and radio ads, very strict limits on the amount of time, only a certain number of seconds, 10 or 15 seconds. You can't use the song in its entirety. Usually that's one of the rules. So, but I would say to get your best shot of getting this approved, you want to provide as much information as possible up front. Let them know if there are any other pre-existing songs. They're going to want assurance that all music publishers are being treated on a favored nations basis. No one's getting a better deal, more favorable deal. Let them know the specific, the standard royalty in the theater world. If it's a Broadway show, 4.5%. With the usual calculation for a royalty pool or net operating profits. They basically want to know that they're being treated the same as the composer and lyricist. That they'll get their pro rata share of the overall royalty for music and lyrics. That would be my advice. You want to be as specific as possible, give them as much information as possible, spell it all out in a very clear written proposal. That'll be a big help. They'll probably still come back with questions, and in my experience, they tend to be very slow to respond. Again, this is not high priority for them, but I think that's a good place to start.
I saw this, you talked about paying attention to just the commercials on the TV or what's happening. I saw this in a micro sense. We just, as this is being recorded, we just had Mother's Day, and I got a Mother's Day card, and it played music. Mm-hmm. And the music was Mom, song by Meghan Trainor. And I was like, somewhere there has to have credit to her. And sure enough, on the back of the card was listed the writers of the song, the publishing house, like all of the details. And it wasn't, we timed it was 15 seconds of the song. But you're right. Everything, we give credit where it's due. It's appropriate. It's part of, I'm not going to pretend to understand the nuances of the WGA strike, but I'd like just appreciating the art of creating in all forms and giving credit to everybody, I think is at the core of granting and acquiring rights. So very good.
Yeah,
very good.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk about, Michael, the writer-producer relationship. You have worked with a number of producers and engaged through this process of granting and acquiring rights, seen the relationship between producers and writers, or authors and producers. Like what are your tips for creating the best relationship between an author and a producer?
It's all about transparency and communication and honesty. The authors want to know that their voices are being heard. They want to be, in the theater world, the authors will always be part of the process. They're critical. But, you don't want to have a producer that's just going to go off, and there's certain contractual approval. For example, there's certain contractual rights that authors would have. And at a minimum, they would have the right to, approval rights over the director, the designers, basically all the members of the creative team, the orchestrator. But the authors maybe wouldn't have approval over, for example, the advertising and marketing plan. But even though they don't have a contractual approval right, the best relationships between producers and authors are where a producer will keep those authors in the loop, keep them informed about what's happening at every stage, and even to the point of, let them know this is the logo that we've come up with. Now, I will say that this is outside of my, as a lawyer, I'm often not involved. I'm not, I'm involved at the point of dealing with the contract, getting the rights, getting it in writing and getting signed. But there's so much that goes on outside of, I'm not involved in those, day-to-day communications that happen. You would be able to speak a lot more to that,
Well, I'm just laughing because, Michael, I feel like part of what makes you so good at your job is your encouragement to me of make sure that the writers know this, and you better remind them of this, like encouraging me to keep all the writers in the loop, because the writer's job can be very specific, as is the producers, and we need each other. But I also appreciate the reminder to make sure that we, as we're going down our own paths, that we have really important intersecting points. So,
the relationship that a producer has with a show can continue on for many, many years after that show closes. And what I mean is, again, going back to what I said earlier, in the theater world, the authors generally retain copyright in their work. A producer comes along and acquires the right to produce that show. Again, what the particular rights that an author acquires are going to be limited, but so let's say that producer produces the show on Broadway. It may be successful, it may be not, or somewhere in between. Maybe it's not a mega hit show that runs for 10 years, but maybe it runs for a couple years on Broadway. Maybe it even recoups, or comes close to recouping. But that if the show runs for a few years on Broadway, it will, that producer would have put in a great deal of time and money and effort to increase the value of that property. That musical, which maybe no one in the world ever heard of, and then this producer came along and with the help of investors, put up a lot of money, developed it, had a whole developmental process, readings, workshops, brought it all the way to Broadway. Maybe it ran for a couple years on Broadway, and now it's a known product. As a result, that producer's production may have closed, but that show will go on. The authors who own the copyright in the work will be able to go out and license productions of that show. Maybe there's another commercial production somewhere down the line in the future, or maybe not commercial productions, but stock and amateur productions, what we refer to in the industry as subsidiary right productions, and there can be subsidiary rights as a broad term that refers to really any future disposition, live stage or audiovisual, film, TV. But the world of stock and amateur productions in the U.S. in particular is a very big industry. Smaller productions, high school productions, community theaters, regional theaters, and it can generate quite a significant amount of money. And the commercial producer, the one who produced the show on Broadway and with that production that ran for a couple of years, that producer will be entitled to receive a certain percentage of the author's future income. The rationale being that the producer, like I said, added value to the property by developing it and running it on Broadway for several years. So when I said that relationship can continue for a long time, the producer may be participating in as much as up to 40% of the author's future income for many, many years. Going forward, 10 years, up to 20 years. Under the Dramatists Guild APC, it could be as much as up to 40 years.
Now, Michael, we've had these conversations, and this can be a real sticking point for writers, that this is their livelihood, why should they be sharing any future rights with a producer? Like, I kind of sometimes feel as a producer, like, what did the producer do? I'm the one that blood, sweat, and tears wrote these words on the page. Why would I be sharing the rights? What do you say to that?
I would say to the author, you likely would not have the income to share, or you'd have a much lesser amount, if not for this producer who came along and produced the show on Broadway. Yes, it's true, you're sharing a significant percentage of your income, but you might not have any of that income if it wasn't for the Broadway production.
It's interesting, Michael, and this is as we try to demystify or have candid conversations, I think there's a misconception that producers, two things. One, do it for the money, and two, have a lot of money. At this stage, when a show is being developed, I feel like I'm on the same page as the writer. That's kind of a funny pun, but as the writer is doing their work as a producer without any income or any, payout, I am getting investors and trying to help support the development of the show. Neither of us are making any money. And so it's not until the show actually gets to a stage, then once it's recouped from the investors, that's this three part of the triangle, right? Then there's able to make sure that everyone who has been valued for their time putting it into the process. So yes, you've said it. And I hope I don't get angry emails from people who say those big bad producers are just trying to steal everything for the writers.
No, but you are correct that as a producer, during that entire developmental process, up until the point where the show is actually up and running in a commercial production in front of a paying audience, there can be many years where you're putting in a significant amount of your time, often your own money. There might be some money raised by investors, but it's a tremendous amount of time and effort that producers put in during that developmental process with no payment up front, right? That's true. And so there should be a payment, if you can get to the point where the show is, where you can capitalize it and get it in front of a commercial production and selling tickets to a paying audience. Now, I will say, just to slightly modify something you just said a minute ago, it's not necessarily that you have to wait until, as a producer, you will start to get paid before the show recoups. And that same is true for the authors. Because once the show begins performances from day one, you're selling tickets and performances begin, it could still be another year or 2 years before the show recoups, or the show may never recoup. But even if the show never recoups, once performances begin, there will be a royalty that gets paid to the authors and to the producer. So there's typically different forms of compensation that go to the producer. The producer gets a royalty, just like the authors and all of the other members of the royalty pool, the creative royalty participants. What that generally includes the authors, plural, the director, the choreographer. Sometimes the designers could be in the pool or not. The orchestrator, arranger, the producer, and underlying rights owner, if there is an underlying rights. So from day one of the start of performances, there's a royalty. Producers usually pay themselves an executive producer fee. So that's usually just a flat dollar amount, a weekly amount that could be, it depends if it's Broadway or off Broadway. For a Broadway musical, that executive producer fee is usually $3, $4, could be $5,000 a week. That's in addition to the royalty. So those are there's forms of producer compensation that get paid. Then once the show recoups, then you're getting a share of the profits.
And can we talk about we talk about the option, but I want to make sure that listeners know how the writers are being taken care of. When we talk about granting and acquiring rights, there is an exchange of money in that part of granting and acquiring rights, right? Paying the authors for the option period, and then the extension of that option period.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So there's an option. which means that you have a certain amount of time, a certain period of time, the option period, to get the show up and running and produce it. Now, these are usually broken down in periods of 12 months. Sometimes they might be 18 months or even 24 months. But I'll just say the standard, the Dramatists Guild standard under the approved production contract, APC, the initial 12-month period, the option payment is $18,000. These are very outdated numbers. The APC has not been updated in like 30 years, maybe even 35 years, something like that. And so, there may be the producer and the authors may negotiate a greater amount, but that's the minimum, $18,000 to the authors for the initial 12-month period. Again, that's the authors alone, not including an underlying rights owner. Now, you're not going to get the show up and running in 1 year. You're going to need more time than that. You're going to need 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years. So then there's going to be an additional payment to extend for a second year and another payment to extend for a third year. And typically that option applies just for the initial territory. Let's say it's the United States and Canada. If you want to produce the show in the UK or in foreign territories, there would typically be additional option periods for foreign territories. But we're just focused on the US. There'd be an initial upfront option payment for a particular period of time. Those payments are usually recoupable against the future royalties. Those payments, I'll just say, this is not like the movie industry where there's a much, much higher payment up front. In the theater world, the upfront payments, and for an off-Broadway, I'm talking about, for an off-Broadway production or smaller production, the upfront payment may be only a couple $1,000s or something, or, could be $2,500, could be maybe $5,000, but it's much smaller. But even for a Broadway production, $18,000 is not a huge amount of money. The basic structure in the theater world is low upfront payments, and if the show's a hit, then the real significant money comes on the back end. That's it's a back end business, the theater, in general.
Thank you for that clarification. Last question, Michael. So we've talked about granting and acquiring rights as the foundational contract. We've talked about how rights can be broken down into different bundles. We've also talked about the writer-producer relationship, which really comes down to communication and respect for each other. And then we talked also about the specifics of the monetization for both parties. Michael, you have represented both authors and producers. If you were speaking to authors, what would be your advice in working with a producer?
Yeah, it's true. I've represented both sides. You want to have a productive, a good, successful, productive relationship, and everyone benefits if that's the case, and the show can move forward. I find it's never really productive you don't want to get too contentious. That's not going to benefit anyone. However, depending on who I'm representing, if I'm representing authors, then and there's a certain framework that we work in within the industry. There are certain terms that are just sort of understood, that are standard, and you can push the limits a little bit one way or the other, and it also depends on the particular property and who the clients are. If these are first-time authors that have never been produced before and relatively inexperienced, that's going to change the deal. Versus if you're dealing with the Stephen Sondheims of the world, Tony Award winners, or so those are all factors to take into account. But in general, if I'm representing the authors, I'm going to want to limit the option period to as little time as possible and I'm going to want to try to get as much payment as possible. The producers want the opposite. They want to get the greatest amount of time for the lowest possible amount of payment. And so that's where that's where the negotiation is, and you try to meet in the middle, and you meet somewhere in the middle. And the same is true for all the other major deal points. The royalty really hardly gets. There's not much negotiation. There's sort of just the accepted. But there are variations on the royalty which do get negotiated, which we probably don't have time to get into. But amortization, which is a mechanism which allows the producer to pay back the investors faster than they otherwise would and achieve recoupment faster. And in order to do that, they pay the authors and all the other royalty participants a little bit less. They pay their investors back faster, they reach recoupment, and then the authors and the other royalty participants get an extra bonus after recoupment. That's the basic summary of how amortization usually works. To your point, if I'm representing the authors, I want to get greater approval rights. I want to get, maybe I try to get a greater, billing credit. I'm going to want their credit to appear, basically everywhere, wherever the title appears. If I'm representing the producer, there are certain exceptions to the billing credit, that, they're not going to get billed on, maybe not on the marquee, or not on certain types of advertising, not on outdoor billboards or outdoor advertising, not in certain print ads that are very small, smaller than a quarter page. These are all sort of deal points that get negotiated. So where and when the billing appears, outside of just on the title page of the playbill, that's something where there's a back and forth, negotiation. Even the subsidiary rights, you might want to, there'd be a negotiation on when, if it's a first-class Broadway production, there's not much to negotiate. You basically just go by the Dramatists Guild APC. But for an off-Broadway, a smaller production, that's going to be a negotiation. If I'm representing the authors, I'm going to want, before the producer can even begin to vest in a subsidiary rights participation, I want to make sure that the producer has actually presented a certain number of performances in front of a paying audience. And now that number, maybe it's 16, maybe it's 21 performances, 24 or more. And these are things that get negotiated. And they wouldn't start out right off the bat with a full participation, 30 or 40%. They would start out at a lower percentage, 10%, and then build up based on the number of performances that they present. If I'm on the other side of that negotiation, if I'm representing a producer, I'm going to want that participation to be as much as possible, and for as long as possible, the greatest possible number of years. And the opposite is true if I'm representing the authors. So, almost every one of the other theater lawyers who I work with in the industry have they've also been on both sides of this negotiation, representing authors in some cases and producers in the other. So we all know, what how this negotiation is going to play out. But you go through it and you eventually reach common ground. I hope that was helpful. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, you really did. And as we wrap up this conversation, I mean, if people can't tell by listening, to work with you is to work with a wealth of knowledge. And I would highly encourage people to contact Michael Sinder when you have a project and you need counsel on how to make through all of these different points from various perspectives. If you are the author, make sure you are aware of the negotiating points and the approvals and what the subsidiary rights could be. If you are the investor, make sure the producer has acquired the rights. If you are the producer, make sure that the first thing that you've done is acquire the rights so that you can move forward and have a good relationship with the writers, because together that's how we create the beautiful work that we do on this big, beautiful, colorful way, Broadway. So Thank you, Michael Sinder. You get the last word. Advice or caution or encouragement. What would you like to say?
I would just encourage anyone who wants to get into this business, whether a producer or a writer or in any other aspect, do it. It's great. It can be a little daunting, but go for it. It's such a wonderful art form. And I work primarily in the world of commercial theater, but there are so many not-for-profit theater companies, community theaters, all over the country. And get started in one way, get your foot in the door however you can. I just think it's a great business to be in. Those are my parting words.
Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks.